Hey, welcome to Sketchy EBM. My name is Anthony Crocco, and today we're talking about pay-for-results metrics. Sometimes it's also called pay-for-performance. This video mostly applies to hospitals in Ontario who have emergency departments that see over 30,000 patients per year. Performances of individual sites are usually compared to the results of all 74 mid to large EDs in Ontario. I've heard some people say that healthcare in Ontario is free. Well, let me assure you, for those of you who don't already know, it's not free. Our tax dollars fund the government, and the government funds the healthcare system. Ergo, not free. The government keeps track of a number of performance metrics to see how hospitals are doing. And the better the hospital does, the more money they get. The metrics the government's interested in may include things like time to initial assessment by a physician, the time it takes for the patient to get to an inpatient bed, discharge time, left without being seen rate, and some ambulance offload times. For any one of these metrics, the government usually has some threshold below which they want the hospital to perform at. For our examples today, we're going to use 2 hours as our cutoff. I think it's important for you to know what metrics the government is collecting for your site and what numbers you're trying to beat. One of the ways that the government decides if you've done well or not is to see how you're doing with 90% of patients. Now, what does this exactly mean? Well, let me start off by saying what it doesn't mean. For those of us who aren't super math whizzes, and I put myself in this category, I often think about averages. Let's imagine for a second that we're measuring how long it takes for a physician to get to a patient in the emergency department. The government may have a goal of 2 hours, and our average time may be 2.3 hours. And perhaps the top 90% of patients are seen within 1.9 hours. We may then think that we've actually passed this performance metric. As it turns out, this is not what the government is looking for when they look for 90% of patients to be beating a certain metric. So what is it exactly then that we're trying to do when we're trying to beat the 90% number? As it turns out, it's actually an easy concept. It's just not intuitive. Think about it as pass or fail. For us to win at any given metric, 90% of our patients must pass, which means that at maximum 10% can fail. The best way to illustrate this is with a couple of examples. We're going to use 2 hours as our government goal, but this is just for example only, and it's up to you to know which metrics the government is collecting at any given time and what the goals are for your site. So let's imagine we've got 100 patients presenting to the emergency department. Our goal is to have them seen by a physician within 2 hours. In this example, the average patient waited 1.5 hours. However, of the 100 patients, 11 waited more than 2 hours. Now remember, the government is only interested in pass-fail and making sure that 90% of patients pass. And in this case, only 89% of patients passed, with 11 failing, which means for this metric, we actually lost. All right, let's look at another example. In this example, we've got 100 patients showing up, and the average wait is 2.1 hours. There were 9 people who waited over 2 hours, which drew the average up. So do we win or do we lose? Well, again, we have to look at how many patients passed the metric. In this case, 91% of patients passed the metric, only 9% failed, which means that we actually won. Now I'd like to go through an example where the number of patients are smaller. For some metrics, for instance, time to a hospital bed, you may not actually have that many patients per day. So let's say the emerge is seeing 100 patients in a day and there's a 10% admission rate, that means 10 patients are going to be admitted per day. If the government is interested in making sure these patients get up to their bed on the ward within 2 hours, and there's only 10 patients per day, this now means that at least 9 of the 10 patients need to pass this metric for us to win. If more than one patient takes more than 2 hours to get to their inpatient bed, we've actually failed this metric. As you can see, when the number of patients that are included in any given metric is small, it doesn't take much for us to fail that metric. So what do I want you to remember at the end of the day? Well, I think we need to remember that the government isn't looking for us to beat some sort of 90% average. What they want us to do is have 90% of our patients pass the metric. It's really pass or fail. And for Ontario, 90% of our patients had better pass. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Sketchy EBM. Please take the time to evaluate, and as always, draw your own conclusions.